Good evening to all who have come here to Conti Forum here on the campus of Boston College for our second event in as many years addressing the relationship between Catholic faith and public policy. My name is Tim Muldoon. I am the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center here at Boston College. It's my privilege to welcome you here. I'd like to welcome also Tim Russert, our special guests, Senators Christopher Dodd, Sam Brownback. Welcome to the many informed citizens who are the students at Boston College. I wish also to welcome the alumni and friends of the university, including those who are joining us via the live webcast. We hope that this forum will enliven public conversation about how committed lives of faith can give rise to political thought and political action on behalf of the common good. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce the man whose vision gave rise to the Church in the 21st Century Center, the president of Boston College, the Reverend William P. Leahy of the Society of Jesus. Thank you.
Let me add my welcome to all of you who are here tonight and express my gratitude to Tim Russert and to our panelists that you'll be hearing from in a little bit. As you know, tonight's event is sponsored by Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Center. This initiative was launched in May 2002 in the midst of the clerical sexual abuse scandal, and it was begun to help the Catholic community in the United States move from crisis to renewal. C21 started with a focus on three critical issues. First, the roles and relationships involving laymen and women, priests and bishops, and how to enhance them. Second, sexuality in Catholic teaching and contemporary culture. And third, the challenge of handing on the Catholic faith to succeeding generations. A fourth focus, encouraging reflection on the Catholic intellectual tradition, was added 18 months ago. I have to say that C21 has been successful beyond our hopes. In the past 5 years, approximately 40,000 people have attended 250 events on campus and around the country, and an average of 2,500 people a month have visited the C21 website. 160,000 people receive C21 Resources, one of our publications, and more than 5,300 people from 49 states, the District of Columbia, and 68 other countries have participated in C21 online courses designed for adult Catholics. C21 has also partnered with Crossroad Publishers on a book series, and thus far 5 volumes dealing with critical issues facing the Catholic Church have been published. It's certainly my belief, and many of the people at BC, that the kinds of initiatives that C21 and all of us at Boston College have been involved in have made and will continue to make a significant contribution to the renewal of the Church and the Catholic community in our nation and in our world. I think tonight's discussion will contribute to that renewal as 2 Catholic senators and presidential candidates engage in a conversation about their Catholic faith and public policy. And as you know, we are fortunate to have as our moderator Tim Russert, regarded by many as the best and the most influential journalist on the Washington scene. He is also a great friend to this institution. father of one of our students, and holder of a BC honorary degree. So please join me in welcoming Tim, as well as Senator Dodd from Connecticut and Senator Brownback from Kansas, as they discuss their faith and public policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Father, and welcome all. I must say something tonight about Boston College. Over the last week, the horrific tragedy in Blacksburg, Virginia, with Virginia Tech, and those of us covering that story were all looking for some ray of goodness, some ray of optimism. And suddenly I picked up a newspaper, and there was the Boston College community gathered together at St. Ignatius Church, holding candles, praying for the families of those who were deceased. What an important statement and what a unifying force this university community was all across the country. It was an extraordinary moment, and those of us in Washington covering the story certainly noted it. It is a real joy and honor to be here with Senator Chris Dodd and Senator Sam Brownback, two men of intellect and integrity. Many times I meet the press, I have options to interview people like, for example, Yogi Berra, the great philosopher, king of baseball, who is not quite in the same league as these two gentlemen. And I asked Yogi one Sunday, did he really say all the things they say he said? When you come to the fork, take it. Or no one goes to that restaurant anymore because it's too crowded. His son told me that he went to a pizzeria and the waiter said, Yogi, what would you like? He said, pepperoni and mushroom pizza. And the waiter said, you want that cut in 6 or 8 slices? And Yogi said, 6, I can't eat 8. This is what the person I was interviewing. And so Whitey Ford was there, the great Yankee pitcher. He said, Tim, it's worse than you think. We were playing the Boston Red Sox one night, and Whitey said he had been out late the night before with Mickey Mantle. And the first pitch, 1960, Pete Reynolds, single to right field. Second pitch, Don Budden, believe it or not, got a hit to left field. The third pitch, he hit Ted Williams. Fourth pitch, Vic Wirtz, big power hitter, gone, grand slam. 4 Whitey Ford pitches, 4-0 Red Sox. Casey Stengel came out from the dugout. Yogi came out from the mound, took off his mask, and Casey said, hey, Yogi, does Whitey have a stuff tonight? He said, how the hell do I know? I haven't caught a ball yet. That is not our problem tonight. Chris Dodd and Sam Brownback are men who have committed their lives to public service. Senator Brownback went to the Kansas State University, where he was president of the student body, the University of Kansas Law School, where he was class president, was the Secretary of Agriculture in the state of Kansas, spent 2 years in the House of Representatives, 10 years in the United States Senate, and he is now a Republican candidate for president. Please welcome Senator Brownback. Chris Dodd, a graduate of Providence College, and this might be a misprint. It says he cheered for the Friars over the Eagles in this very building. Can't be true.
Can't be true.
After Providence, Senator Dodd joined the Peace Corps as a volunteer in rural Dominican Republic. Serving his country, came home, served in the Army National Guard for 6 years, attended and graduated from the University of Louisville Law School, 6 years in the House of Representatives, 26 years in the United States Senate. He is a Democratic candidate for president. We welcome you.
Thank you very much.
I flipped the coin on the plane on way up here, Senator Dodd, and you get the first question.
Good.
How has your Catholic faith influenced your public service?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you, Father Leahy, and the community of Boston College for having us here this evening. I thought it was rather ecumenical of you to invite a guy from Providence College to be as faith in the 21st century would dictate. And Tim, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with my colleague and friend Sam Brownback from Kansas as well. And faith has had a huge influence on me, along with other things as well. My My spiritual home is my Catholicism. Certainly the biography which you've alluded to here had an awful lot to do with the decisions I made to go into the Peace Corps, to be active in Big Brothers, to run for Congress, to be in the United States Senate, and then the choices that I've made on substantive matters that I've dealt with in the Congress. Faith had a lot to do with those decisions. Coming from a Catholic social tradition or teachings about dealing with the common good, creating safety nets for those who are disadvantaged, those who suffer from various conditions through no fault of their own, seeking help and assistance, being involved with the Children's Caucus, the Family and Medical Leave Act, a lot of decisions involving those particular questions were affected as a result of faith. Beyond faith, it's your family, it's your experiences in life, it's your competency you bring to those choices. Some choices you don't have much decision-making in the process. When I arrived in the Senate in 1981, I was one of 2 Democrats elected that year, and 16 Republicans came in. There was a sweep, the Ronald Reagan election, and I didn't get a choice of committee assignments. I was told I could sit on the Banking Committee, and there was a seat on the Foreign Relations Committee, and then a seat on the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, and that was it, in a sense. But in a sense, there was a sort of a divine intervention, if you will, in that regard, that ending up on a committee with people who are dealing with education issues, healthcare issues, having served in Latin America in the Peace Corps, speaking Spanish and wanting to pay attention to what happened in this hemisphere, that involvement, those committee assignments gave me a chance to be involved in questions that were tremendously important. I've always felt this, Tim, and people have different views on this, but the way I've carried this is faith it informs my decisions. It doesn't define my decisions, but informs them strongly, along with its other influences that have caused me to make the choices I have had and the life you grow up with. My family, growing up as a child in what would be considered a very large family by today's standards, one of 6 children. My father was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials in 1945 when I was a year old. And my family, my brothers and sisters and I grew up listening to my father talk about the rule of law, what had happened when the world had lost its way and violence dominated the world scene. And that experience growing up in a family with those kind of influences had a profound effect as well in the decision-making process. Teachers, brothers and sisters who were teachers, academics, working in those institutions as well, had a large influence as well. So the confluence of all of these things have really contributed and still do significantly on the decision-making process.
Senator Brownback, same question.
Thanks, Tim. Let me say what a pleasure it is to join you here, and thank you for being out on a Monday night. Several thousand people out for politicians talking about this issue, which I consider very important on a Monday night. Congratulations, and God bless you for doing it on a beautiful day. I appreciate that very much. Appreciate being able to join my colleague Chris and Tim as well. And if I can quote Yogi Berra, this seems deja vu all over again for me of sorts. I did this with Rick Warren, who wrote Purpose-Driven Life at his church in California with Barack Obama. And we were talking about much kind of the same sort of things, which I find very heartening, that I think we as a society are trying to find our way back into talking about how faith does inform things, rather than just dismissing it or saying, well, we really can't go there, or separation of church and state says we can't even talk about it. No, I mean, we're a faith-oriented country. Our motto is "In God We Trust," and so we should talk about things of faith and how it informs, and we'll get into the depths of that here. My faith is a very big part of what informs my decisions. I was raised Protestant. I was raised in a small farming community, Parker, Kansas. It's 250 people. We lived in the suburbs. We were 1.5 miles out of town. We were on city water, so we thought that qualified for suburbs. It was a great growing up. We had one church in town. It was a Methodist church, so I grew up a Methodist. Joined the Catholic Church about 4 years ago, and have been delighted to be a part of it. I think the concept, and I don't get quite all these concepts right, but the concept of the unitary person or the unitary man, to me, I think is important, that the faith is a part of you. It's a part of who you are, and it helps inform your decision. It doesn't make all the decisions, but you can't segregate it out. It's a part of the values basis that you bring, and that's what it does for me as well. And I'm delighted to have it. It is a big part of the decision-making process, and I've tried in the past, Tim, to segregate out my faith from the policy work or politics, and I find I end up getting everything wrong. I get my faith wrong. I generally don't look at politics or policy quite right, and I'm not happy at the end of the day, and I don't like it in the morning when I wake up and look at myself in the mirror. So I think it's just, it's part of who I am, and it helps inform a lot of it.
What drew you to Catholicism?
I haven't talked a lot about it, primarily because I felt a real calling to join the Catholic Church. I was at that point in time in an evangelical church, which I still attend. I was there yesterday at the evangelical church with my family. They didn't join the Catholic Church as well, but I felt a deep calling to join. I studied and thought about it a long period of time, and then ended up joining the Catholic Church. And I have to say, I love the depth of thought that's there. And coming from the Protestant tradition, you don't build as much on past people's comments or saints, and going into the Catholic Church, and you got people who've been thinking about something for 2,000 years, and it's a great source of wisdom. And maybe I can appreciate it better than many who have been raised in the Catholic Church, that I look at it, and to me it's a bit like growing up on that farm in Kansas. We bought feeder cattle as part of our business, and we sold fat cattle, so we fattened them up. And we always wanted to buy an animal that was thin and hadn't been fed very well, but knew what food was. Because then they would go and they'd really eat. And I look at that in the Catholic Church coming into it. There is just a wealth of feeding of the soul that's there. And I think it's a beautiful faith that can really help the world out a lot on some of our key problems.
Senator Dodd, do you think that the Democrats have allowed the Republicans the turf of talking about faith and moral values much more than the Democrats allowed themselves?
No question. I think we've made a huge mistake, in my view, over the years, because we haven't engaged in the conversation as we can and should, in my view. Put aside the differences, and you want to be careful because I don't think not everyone fits into these neat, tidy categories on various issues. But the Catholic social teaching that I mentioned earlier about reaching out to those who are underprivileged or those who are suffering in some way, this is very much the tradition many of us grew up with. In a sense, the decisions I mentioned earlier that you've made, I don't think we do enough in a sense of talking about why we do those things. What is the genesis of our involvement in those questions? Where does it come from? You go back in the early part of the history of this country in the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt's decisions on Social Security came out of Rerum Novarum, a text from the Vatican, in a sense, and talking about the importance of the social net, in a sense. So, interestingly, I don't think there's a lot of knowledge. I regret that a lot of my friends in this party don't know the own history of the genesis of the social policies in this country that emerged as a result of social Catholic teaching. And so these responsibilities we feel collectively, the sense of community that has always been a much part of our tradition as the Catholic faith, is something that I don't think we take enough of a time to focus on and to talk about. And it may be that some are just uneasy. This notion of the separation of church and state, which we all revere and support strongly, when we talk about the separation of church and state, I think we create this image in our minds of a wall, the sense that there's a wall between church and state. And that has had value for having some sort of a painting of a picture. I've always thought a better description of that separation would be wiser if we talked about it in the context, and this I picked up on someone lately talking about, as a window, in a sense, between the two. Not a window that necessarily opens and closes, but the idea that faith can influence policy, and that state can influence, in a sense, how we deal and allow for the space and the tolerance of religious traditions in this country. In a sense, not separated entirely from each other, but in a sense reflecting and learning from each other without commingling, in a sense. And I don't think we've done a very good job, Tim, over the years of connecting those ideas and concepts. We speak very clearly about that separation, but have in the past at least been unwilling or unable, for whatever reasons, to make the connections between the importance of having a value-based decision-making process, particularly given the historic, at least, association of the Democratic Party with those commitments to that social safety net, that common good, that sense of obligation to reach out to those in the community that do not have the support structures to assist them.
Hey, Tim, can I jump in on this
Please.
separation? Because I hear Chris's struggle with this, and that we as a country are, and I like the analogy that I read another person said, that the wall of separation, there is a separation of church and state, has no problem with it being a wall, but it shouldn't be a wall so high that the two can't meet. That you can't have a discussion of faith that goes into the public square, so that it's a low wall that's there. And that is not to support a theocracy. I'm opposed to a theocracy. I think it would be bad for religion and bad for government too. But I think there is that wall, but it just shouldn't be so high that the two can't meet to talk.
And certainly not a state-sponsored religion.
Absolutely opposed to that. Can you imagine that? What would the Church of the United States look like?
Senator Dodd.
But there'd be a good Jesuit running it, I know.
Senator Dodd, do you think that Democrats should publicly embrace the Sermon on the Mount and talk about that as a roadmap to what they believe their social commitment should be?
I don't think they ought to have any. Yeah, that analogy certainly it could be, or the commandment, obviously, of the good, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and talking about your responsibility. That's where that tradition that I've always believed comes from. That sense of the first commandment, most important, love God with thy whole heart and thy soul, and second is love thy neighbor as thyself, in a sense, to reach out. And again, I think there's been. Part of it is going back over the years. Remember, there was a long tradition in our country of being very resistant to the idea of crossing over these lines, whatever analogy you want to use, that symbolism here. And there's a still very strong and should be a strain of that. One of the reasons that Catholicism has done so well in this country from our more recent history anyway is because of the tolerance in our society for religions. We have blossomed because, in fact, there has been a tolerance of religious beliefs in this country. The old notion that there is going to be a state-sponsored church, or that certain religions are sanctioned and others are not, has been a great, great gift to Catholicism in the United States. And so, in a sense, that tradition, if you will, that separation has been very, very important. But using the language of parables, I think is something we don't do often enough, and should. It allows us to make a connection, I think, with people who oftentimes don't understand the value or where this comes from. And I think to the extent we do more of that would be valuable.
When 90% of the people in the United States express a belief in God, and they don't hear those kinds of words or a belief system from a party, it does create a gap.
It can. Again, I think your language has to be careful in all of this. And let me say, the other side of it is, I think, too, this too often can happen, where people confuse, in a sense, the notion of having faith-based politics and replacing politics with faith to such an extent. People need decisions. They want the job done. They want things accomplished. And so we run the risk sometimes of talking and giving the speeches. At the end of the day, after we've made our connections and used the language, Sam and I have to sit down and work this out. We're not a federal court. We sit in a legislative body that represents diverse constituencies. And our constituencies expect us to come up with answers to these questions. We're not doing terribly well at this. But that becomes the responsibility, having taken the genesis of your feelings about this, and then being able to sit down in a way that resolve those differences without allowing them to interfere with your ability to be able to produce the results that we expect as a country. And that has been, I think, a very important part of what's been missing lately, in a sense, that ability to come together around ideas, putting aside differences and finding a common ground, rather than using, if you will, just the language to remind each other of where the differences are. I think the expectation is we find our faith-based traditions to allow us to express those differences, but then the state side of us, if you will, if you want to use that analogy, to come in and be able to create the kind of structures that allow us to resolve problems.
Senator Brownback, some of my Republican friends tell me privately that they think that the Republican Party sometimes has emphasized the Ten Commandments much more than the Sermon on the Mount. and it would be helpful to the country and to their own party if it was a broader appeal. Fair?
I think there's some fairness to that. I had a minister, an African-American minister in Washington, D.C. come in to me one time, and he says, you know, both the parties got a problem. Righteousness and justice travel together in a healthy society. Righteousness, the plumb line, the determination of right and wrong, good from evil, justice, its application. He says, you know, the problem is the Republicans tend to get the righteousness part better, and the Democrats tend to get the justice part better. But you can't separate these two out. Righteousness without justice is a Pharisee. That's somebody that knows the difference between right and wrong and then doesn't do it. Justice without righteousness is you can't set it. Everything becomes an issue of justice then. Whether you have cable TV becomes an issue of justice because you don't have no bearing of what's right and wrong on it. And that's where I think both parties do. And that's what my hope is on the Republican side, that you'll see people coming forward pushing things like being pro-life and whole life. That pro-life is, I am for the child in the womb, and I believe all life is sacred at every point in time, no matter who it is, no matter where they are, no matter what they look like. Period. They are. They're sacred. But that doesn't stop at the womb. It extends to the child in Darfur. It extends to the young man in Congo. It extends to the man in prison. It extends to somebody in poverty. And my view of that is that when we can do that, then people, they will applaud and they will say, now that makes sense to me. That makes sense, the pro-life and whole life. And how we try to do that, that is both righteousness and then justice, its application.
Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago, the late Cardinal Bernardine, talks about the seamless web of life.
It is.
The responsibility. You yourself have traveled extensively to Africa and have been a strong proponent of helping the poor and the AIDS victims in Africa. What in your faith has been responsible for that kind of specific motivation?
Seeing the people there. I mean, you can't help but seeing people in poverty in that situation. And also the story of Lazarus and the rich man haunts me. And I hope some of you will go home tonight and read that story in Luke, I think it's the 12th chapter, Lazarus and the rich man, and you may know it. But the rich man goes in and out gaily every day, and here's poor Lazarus laid at his doorsteps, and he's got sores, and the dog licks his wound, and all the poor man wants is the crumbs from the rich man's table. He doesn't get them, they both die. Poor man goes to heaven, is next to Abraham. The rich man goes to hell. The rich man says, Lazarus, dip your fingers in the water and touch my tongue. I'm burning down here. Lazarus says, I can't. There's a gulf between the two of us. The reason that haunts me is in the world today, I know who would be symbolized by Lazarus and who would be the rich man in this story. We're the rich guy. And I don't like how that story ends. And you shouldn't either. But it doesn't have to end that way. If we will go and just simply engage the poor man and give him the crumbs from our table, then he lifts us up. I mean, for me, engaging in Africa is about saving our souls. It's about helping us. And we help them in the process. And I think it's a profound obligation that we have as this most powerful nation in the history of mankind.
Senator, you were 22 years old. You went to the Dominican Republic because you said your faith had called you to that kind of service. What did you learn in the Peace Corps and in the Dominican Republic that has stayed with you and helps you now fulfill your commitment to other people?
When I applied to the Peace Corps in the senior year at Providence College, I didn't know you could apply to a country-specific place. And so I applied to any country in Africa, Latin America, or Asia, rather discriminating choice to make, and ended up in the Dominican Republic, not far from the Haitian border. It's such a presumptuous idea. I was an English literature major. I could barely say my name in Spanish when I arrived down there. And in fact, I love to tell us, when I was first learning Spanish, I had was out with some people, and they asked me to sit at the table. I was trying to listen to what they were saying and discerning what they were saying. And finally, one fellow at the table, to embarrass me, said to me in Spanish, "¿Crees que diga algo en español?" So I'm trying to think I could. So the guy asked me to say something in Spanish. I don't know my name hardly, but I said, "Well, yo no hablar muchos españoles." And then I don't know why I knew the word frankly. I said, "Francamente." And then I'm trying to think, how do I say I'm embarrassed in Spanish? And I assumed it was sort of like the English. So I said, "Francamente, estoy embarazado." And the Spanish speakers here will know what I'm saying. I'd announced that I was pregnant to this audience here and along the way. I didn't have any idea what I had said along the way. It's so presumptuous in a sense, the Peace Corps. The idea that you're going to go down and teach and eradicate ignorance, poverty, and disease, and all of these wonderful idealistic notions, which are still great. And but I came back having learned a lot more, Tim, than I taught. I'd love to tell you that I made a huge difference. We built a school and a maternity hospital and a library and a youth club and along the way. But it's really what I came back with. First of all, a much healthier perspective, having grown up in the relative security of a suburban community outside of Hartford, Connecticut, with obviously most of the gifts that people didn't have in those days, and seeing and learning how other people live, what their aspirations are, what their hopes are, what their dreams are. No different than anyone else I had met before. What they worry about, their children, their families, what's going to happen to them. And you realize that we're all in this together in a sense, and a deeper appreciation of my own country in a sense, how blessed we've been as a people, the gifts we've been given, the tolerance that exists here, the history and tradition of what we've tried to achieve, that faith and freedom go hand in hand, as has been told us over the years, and how few places that exist in many, many cases. So it was a wonderful gift, and the lessons over the years have not gone away. In fact, a woman who took care of me in that village town, Doña Alicia Valle, a remarkable woman, fed me every morning, kept an eye on my monies for my projects, and Alicia moved to the United States, 187th Street in the Bronx, about 30 years ago, and she brought her 2 children and had 2 grandchildren. One of them graduated from this institution, summa cum laude, just a few years ago, who's now working as the chief financial officer of Citibank, and the other child is working at a cable TV company in New York City. Remarkable story of this woman on a dirt floor shack in the Dominican Republic, raising children that then within a generation could achieve the success they have. It says a lot about her and also a lot about us along the way. Doña Alicia died this last winter at age 95. I was with her in a hospice in the Bronx, a place called Calvary, near the Montefiore Hospital, for those who know that institution down there. Remarkable place, by the way. And she was still wearing the watch that I gave her 46 years ago when I left the Peace Corps. And so Doña Alicia Valle had a lot to do with changing my life. I've always said that my epiphany as a human being occurred in those 2 years in the Peace Corps. I was a very different person coming back than I was when I left. I have a nephew today who's in Africa in the Peace Corps, serving and carrying on a tradition. But I would urge those of you students here thinking about what to do after your collegiate careers, maybe a break before you go on to graduate studies. You'll never do anything as enriching. The Jesuits have a wonderful Peace Corps program, or a volunteer program, as well as a number of other places where you can achieve that same sense of being a part of something larger than yourself. This is the great gift that time provided for so many of us, that there was national leadership in the country that invited us as a people to be involved in bigger questions, to make a difference in our lives. And many people found different ways to express that. But when I mention that to audiences, I go out on this journey that Sam and I are on around the country, whether it's Iowa or Nevada or New Hampshire, South Carolina, and I talk about it, and I look out in the audience and I see some gray hair, and some or less than gray hair in some cases, and I talk about that period. I watch the expression on people's faces change as we remember a time when there was that sense that we had an obligation to do more for other people. And so the Peace Corps had a huge influence, and next to my family, as much of an influence as anything in my life.
I want to talk about church teaching and how it affects or influences political decision-making. The war in Iraq, both of you supported the authorization to go to war in Iraq. 4 years later, as you think about church teaching on just war, about whether or not it was lawful self-defense, about having exhausted all means to avoid it, and whether the evil produced is worse than what had been sought to eliminate it. Reflecting on that, what is your sense now of the war in Iraq and whether it is a just war?
Really tough question, Tim. I mean, you make the call on what information and facts you have at the time, and I don't think it's fair to the troops on the ground to second guess it 4 years later with the information that you have at this point in time. We obviously we've got a mess in Baghdad. There's no question about it. The northern part of the country is going well. I was up in Erbil in the Kurdish region doing well, and so there you could say, okay, that works all right. Now, they were pretty well separated under Saddam anyway. The southern part doing much better than what they were doing under Saddam. The Marsh Arabs doing better than that way. Baghdad's a mess. And I think you're going to end up, I think the only solution past this point is you have some sort of three-state, one-country solution. We have a Kurdish state, a Sunni state, a Shia state with Baghdad as the federal city in a loose federation. Because we're not going to solve the Sunni-Shia fight. And the best I think we can do is to try to provide some way for them to separate themselves on out of it. But it's a very difficult situation, and there has been a lot of death that's taken place. I think at this point forward, what we've got to do is get a political solution that can match the military solution it needs, and move towards some sort of political stable environment and get the death loss down. I think that's what we've got to do at this point.
Senator Dodd has described the war by the president as a war of necessity rather than a war of choice. Looking back now 4 years later, do you think Iraq is a just war?
No, I don't. In my view, and I'm one who was appointed to the authorization in 2002 along with Sam. And I know the arguments that were given to us at the time, but we've learned in retrospect that a lot of those issues were in a sense fabricated. The books were being cooked in too many cases, in my view, to make a case for us to go there. And it's no one in public life there are two answers that people in public life never like to give. One is I made a mistake, and the other is I don't know. And two answers that can be refreshing from time to time.
You'll never be Attorney General.
No,
Just the facts. Just the facts. I was quoting Republican Earl Inspector.
We'll be getting a call from Alberto tomorrow morning. On the way.
See if the job's open or not for you, Chris.
I suspect it's going to be pretty quickly. On the way. But look, to me, this is, given the justification of the weapons of mass destruction, all those arguments, let's be all very honest with each other. If Iraq were growing turnips and not oil, we wouldn't be there. This is about energy and about... the question is now, and it's a very legitimate question to ask of us, why did you do what you did in 2002? And I wish I had a better answer for you than I given. I had a responsibility to learn more, and I should have learned more, and I didn't. But that's the decision. Now the question is, what do we do from here? Because it isn't enough just to leave it there, and it's not enough, in my view, just to talk about the military solution here. Like Sam, I assume has been there as well, and talked to a lot of people about this. Was at Walter Reed Hospital a week ago talking to kids from Connecticut who are coming back and wounded. I was telling Father Leahy about this a little while ago. And to a person, this isn't a question where I feel is new. Everyone who's looked at the situation, from Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton, and they're a very distinguished group that analyzed this, as well as our senior military people who've been there for a length of time. I mentioned Brian Freeman to you on your show, in fact, back in January, where I met a young captain, graduate of West Point, who sought out at a helicopter pad in Baghdad when I got there, telling me that this was a mistake. A significant portions on his second tour. A remarkable young man, by the way, who had also performing his military functions, was also performing diplomatic functions because the civilian personnel cannot leave that green zone given the dangers associated with moving out. Brian was also, to give you an idea of the kind of individual he was identifying and working with civilian groups in Iraq with young children who had life-threatening illnesses. and was hooking them up with a group called the Gift of Life in this program. I think it's mostly an Eastern, I don't think it's a national program, but was arranging for Iraqi children to come here for medical attention. And it just arranged for the son of a police officer in Karbala to come here. I mentioned this guy on Tim's show. I can't remember whether it was the end of December, early January, when I was on the Meet the Press and trying to make the case, identified, talked about this young fellow, Brian Freeman, who then watched Meet the Press in Baghdad and started emailing me about his views. Brian was one of those 5 American soldiers who was kidnapped, tortured, and killed in Karbala on January, I think it was January 20th, leaving a 14-month-old and a 2-year-old. Got to know his widow and his family fairly well. And the tragedy of losing people like a Brian Freeman in all of this, to me, worries me. We can do a lot to help. But at this point here, and I agree with Sam on this completely, it's really now for the Sunnis and Shias, the political leadership, the religious leadership, to decide whether or not they want to conquer. And there's not a military big enough or a treasury deep enough that's going to do that for them if the appetite and the desire is not there themselves. And they've got to make that decision. And I'm prepared if they make that decision to try and be supportive at some point in getting there. But in the absence of that, it seems to me and some clarity to this, Tim, as well, some sense of certainty about this. And therefore, for that reason, I've supported this Feingold Reed proposal, which I know is draconian to some, in that it sets a bookend. It starts redeploying immediately and sets the date of next year, and to complete that redeployment. But I think in the absence of certainty here about where we're headed, that I think you're not likely to get the decisions that the Iraqi people have to make themselves. And I just end on this note for you here. I don't know whether it produces the results or not. I'd love to be able to tell you that I'm certain that if we say this and do this, that the Iraqis themselves will then make that decision. But I'm convinced that the status quo will not produce these results. And then I want to see a surge in diplomacy. I'm stunned. I'm absolutely find it stunning that we're treating diplomacy as if it were a gift to your opponents, rather than a very successful tool in the arsenal of advancing your interests and the interests of people who share your values and concerns. I met with President Assad. Others have. Nancy Pelosi just did. And a few weeks ago in a bipartisan delegation that was in Syria. Not there to negotiate but determine whether or not there may be some common ground on this issue. And the notion somehow we don't talk to people we don't like is not a tradition that we're used to in this country. I mean, Ronald Reagan, he'd call it the evil empire, and he'd sit down and do arms negotiations with the Soviets. Richard Nixon was certainly as strong an anti-communist as anyone I can think of growing up, and yet would find the way to meet Mao Zedong and begin to talk about ways to which we can start opening up doors to people. So I don't suggest to you that this is an answer that's going to be satisfactory by just talking about the military part. We're then going to have to do the diplomatic parts and other things that will make it possible for Iraq to get on its feet if it makes that decision. But I think this is going to be huge.
Tim, can I jump in
Please.
just briefly on the end of this? Because I thought Baker Hamilton, the Iraq Study Group, had a lot of good ideas and a way to get us back to having a bipartisan effort. And to me, you cannot conduct a war effort in this country with one party for it and one party against it. It doesn't work. And that's why I thought this was this is a route we can move forward. And it involved getting the neighbors engaged in the region, which I thought was important to do. It didn't talk about this three-country or three-state, one-country solution, although it did provide for it, and the Iraqi Constitution does. And that's what I think we desperately need to do. And frankly, right now, what we're seeing too much in Washington is both sides just saying, okay, it's got to be my way, and the Democrats emphasizing more on the political and the diplomatic, and Republicans more on the military. And the answer lies together on this. The answer is that you've got to have some sort of political solution that's not being really pursued aggressively now, and you're going to need a long-term military effort, like Bosnia, like the Dayton Accords, where you had two groups that didn't get along, and you still have U.S. military present 15 years later. I mean, I think we're learning one thing in the post-Cold War era is that when you remove big military apparatuses off of places, ancient hatreds are still there. The former Yugoslavia, it's now 8 countries. Sudan, you're going to see that be at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 countries in the future. And a guy told me once, if you see a straight line border in the Middle East or Africa, you ought to raise a question about it, whether it really reflects reality or not. And when you pull these military apparatuses off, you've got to deal with these real problems on the ground. And I think we've got one in Iraq, where you've got a group that's more 3 groups than it is one country, held together by exterior forces. So you got to work with both.
Tim, can I one thing I fail to do in these discussions, and it comes up a lot, obviously, around, and for all the obvious reasons, we have a tendency to talk, obviously, about what's happened to us. The 3,200 people whose lives have been lost, the Brian Freemans, the thousands who have been injured. Too rarely do we talk about what's happened to Iraqis. They need to be talked about in this context. They are suffering terribly in this process. There are 2 million who have now had to emigrate from their country, 1 million displaced people in that nation. It's hard to find a doctor in that country. The people are just gone. This has been a decimated place in many ways. And Sam, I don't have any doubt at all about your good willingness at all. You and I know each other very, very well. And I think within the 2 parties, if you want, there probably is some real work that gets done. What's been bothering to me in a sense is that the executive branch level, that sort of unwillingness to bring us together and do this, in a sense. I know, and you and I both know, they're members of our respective parties who have probably a lot more in common on this issue. But the commander-in-chief role is so essential in all of this that office has to as well be at that table. In fact, they ought to be inviting us to their table, in a sense, to move on this.
You share that view?
I not only share that view, I met with the Vice President last week to urge it, and I've called the National Security Advisor to urge it as well. You've got to do that.
Let me turn to another issue, the stem cell research. How does Catholic teaching inform your decision to vote in favor of embryonic stem cell research, Senator?
Well, it's a difficult question, obviously, for a lot of people. There are various. If the choices are about science and embryonic stem cells, in this case here, it's a narrow call, obviously. But what we're talking about here is the ability to take products that might otherwise be lost entirely. In the language that was written, we're talking about embryonic stem cells that would otherwise be discarded. And in my view, when the choice comes down to whether or not you would discard an embryonic stem cell or use it in a way where I think there are some 58 known diseases that could be either cured or substantially improve the quality of life for people, that is something that ought to motivate people to try and do something. Look, I would hope as well that adult stem cell research would produce the results we'd all like to see here. My wife and I, when my 2 children were born, Grace and Christina, we took the umbilical cord blood to store that, not only for my children that may incur some blood disease down the road, but also it provides part of the bank for matches that can occur with other children who have leukemia in other areas, so we can provide a source of help for them. That's a different issue in a sense. I'm not talking there about, but there are stem cells there that can only be blood in that situation. But when the choice, it seems to me, Tim, comes down to a question of discarding embryonic stem cells or utilizing them to make a difference in diabetes and Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's and the like, that choice there, my view is at that point there, the utilizing of these stem cells for that purpose is something that makes sense. I would totally oppose any efforts here to have this cloning that goes on. Sam has been a leader on that issue, and I agree with him on that. That would be a huge mistake in my view. But when the choice is on these 2 sides here, I think we ought to try and find something we can do with it. At the same time, pursue the science that would allow this issue to become a moot one, in a sense, so we're not confronted with a choice that people find difficult to make. And I'd like to see that happen if we could. But in the meantime, it seems to me the value that can be extended to people struggling with life here is certainly a better one than the discarding of these embryos.
Senator Brownback.
Well, it's a live issue, and it's one we've been wrestling with recently in the Senate, and I might suggest to you it's one we've wrestled with since the start of the Republic. And that's the basic question of what is the youngest of human beings. Is the embryo a person or is it property? It's one or the other. Everything in this room is either a person or it's property. You're a person with clothes are property, the lights are property, the table's property is a person. What is the youngest of humans? Is it a person? Is it a piece of property? Now, if you say, all right, it's a person, well, then it's entitled to rights and human dignity. If it's property, it can be done with as its master chooses, whatever you want to. What we are doing in this is treating the youngest of humans as property. And we're saying you can do with it as you choose. You can research on it, you can discard it, but it's your property, and you can do with it as you choose. Throughout human history, throughout American history, whenever we've treated another individual or another human as property, we have always regretted it. We have deeply regretted it. And whenever you treat a weaker person for the benefit of somebody that's stronger, we've always regretted that too. We've been down this road in human history. It's not a good road. And on top of it, we don't need to do it. We've got... I carried the debate on the Senate side opposed to the expansion of human embryonic stem cell research and announced 2 weeks ago the 73rd human malady being treated with adult or cord blood stem cells. And that 73rd one, it was a big one, juvenile diabetes. Juvenile diabetes, one we've been hoping to get something for a long time. The tragedy of it, the researcher was from Northwestern University in Chicago, and he was doing his research in Brazil. Now, I don't know if it was he couldn't find enough interest here. He was being funded partially by the Brazilian government. And I don't know, why is that? And I want us to be a leader on finding these cures. I want it to be ethical cures that we do. I want it to be things when we look back on, we're not sorry we treated somebody else as a piece of property. And if we can raise the level of human dignity in this country and around the world, we'll all be better off for it.
As to Senator Dodd's specific reference to embryos that would be discarded by fertility clinics, how do you respond to that? That if they're not utilized in terms of research, then they are simply discarded, or do you close down fertility clinics?
Well, one, I think we need to start thinking and asking ourselves more, what is it we have here at the fertility clinics? And we haven't really thought much about that in this country. Now, they have more in Europe. In Europe, they will limit the number of embryos that can be created in certain countries at IVF clinics, because they're talking about, well, we've got something of some significance here, and we're not exactly sure what we're all doing, so we're going to have a little more limitations here, where obviously we don't. I'd love to see a lot more adoption of the frozen embryos. And that people that create additional embryos that they're not going to implant, they would put more of them up for adoption, because a lot of people can't have kids, but they want to be able to do that. And we've now had, I think the numbers we had last week, several hundred, or I'm not sure the exact number, that have been adopted. It's a bit at the very nascent stage. But I would hope that as we move forward in the future, that'd be something that more people would look at. So that we can, going back to basic human dignity, which I think is a key thing for us to permeate in our society. We need to consider more human dignity in this society. And the more we can do that, the better off we'll do, from the youngest to the oldest to whoever the person is.
Just to pick up on this is a classic example, and there are others as well, of what's been missing in the country, in my view. We always hear about this notion of how divided we are as a people. And you might discern that here based on applause lines back and forth on these various questions where we sort of choose up sides on something, and this becomes the perpetual sort of game that goes on these very, very important issues. And I've discovered, Tim, that the country's not as divided as we think on this stuff. In fact, more people find themselves wrestling with these questions and looking for some better answers. And if we're going to spend our time in the 21st century as considering our faith-based issues and how we feel about all of this, spending the time sort of driving these wedges deeper and deeper into our society, I very fear for our country in its future. Well, we've got to do a lot better in finding common answers to these questions than just going off to our respective corners and screaming at each other about what we like and dislike about each other on these matters. You just heard two people talk about an issue here that is very important. I heard My friend Sam talked about adoption. Couldn't agree more with him. I think we ought to do a much better job of promoting that. I think it's disgraceful we don't do a better job, help support people making these choices. I think we also need to do more research, in effect, so we can come up with alternatives that get us away, in a sense, from these more difficult questions that we all concern us. But we ought to spend as much time trying to do that, in a sense, and less of the time trying to score points, so to speak, politically, so that someone wins an election by a few points and someone else loses, and we go back and forth, and the country sits there and wonders in disbelief. What has happened to the political leadership in this country? That you can't spend as much time trying to figure out some common answers to this stuff than trying to win just an election so that you may be a chairman or not a chairman of a committee. We need to do more of that, in my view. And I'm convinced most people want us to do that in this country. They'd like to see us come together and try to figure out these things rather than just sit there and sort of tearing at each other.
I want to raise another issue, and that is the death penalty. And I read both of you and your works in thinking about it. Picked up the USA Today, and the headline is DNA to clear 200th person. Over the last 10 years now, and 100 in the last 5 years, people who had been in prison convicted of a crime were freed because DNA tests came back demonstrating convincingly that they were not guilty. And it's not complicated to think through history. There may have been people, in fact, sentenced to death because there was not DNA to have them released. Senator Brownback, as you look at church teaching on the death penalty and your own in terms of political life, where are you now?
Well, it's a tough issue, and it's an important one, and you point out innocent lives. Had the chance to meet a few gentlemen, a few men on death row. I spent a night in prison in Angola, Louisiana, of my own volition, I want to add. I was not convicted of a crime when I went in there.
We Democrats hope we might spend a little more time down there. Only teasing.
I'm opposed to the death penalty other than in cases of where we cannot protect the society from the individual. Such as when we catch Osama bin Laden. I don't believe we'll be able to protect the society from Osama bin Laden if he remains alive, and I think there the death penalty be merited. Past that, I don't think we should be using the death penalty, and my own thinking on this has evolved over time. When I first ran for office, I was for a much more expansive use of the death penalty. But what I've seen over the years is a couple of things on this, and I believe the church's teaching are more this is prudential judgment and what you deem to be right or wrong. My difficulty is that if I want to get a culture of life in America, I want to get a culture that really is radically life-oriented, affirming of life. And it seems to me to be difficult to teach a culture of life if the state continues to use death in its process. And that's where I have difficulty with it, even though I recognize a number of people view this differently, and that I think that they have valid grounds to stand on. I just think for us to move forward in the culture of life, it becomes more difficult, and we do have a number of these DNA cases that are going on as well.
How about a moratorium on people on death row being put to death until this can be looked at and more resolved in terms of how the death penalty is applied?
I've looked at sponsoring legislation on studying that point, not on putting the moratorium forward. I'm not willing to go to that distance yet to do that, because I think we're still involved in the nation for as far as deciding where we really exist and view on the death penalty. But I certainly think it's something that we ought to dig into and look at. And see and study more of the number of cases that these have been overturned and the broad case of where DNA evidence is available and where it's not been available, and have a better understanding of that throughout the country.
Senator Dodd.
I know these gatherings like this, you have a Republican and a Democrat sitting with each other, and the expectation is of sparks. I just want you to know, I didn't know that Sam had done what he had done until a few weeks ago when I saw, I think it was a television program about it, but to Sam Brownback to go and spend those couple of days in a prison in Louisiana, I thought was terrific, and I want to commend you for doing it. It was a wonderful thing to have done, and I admire you for doing it.
You ought to try it. It's really interesting.
There are a number of people who would love to see me be in prison someday.
I'm not saying that.
But it is a...
Did you ever spend a night in prison, Senator?
No, I haven't. I tell you, I probably should have. But we were talking earlier about how does your faith influence your politics or your decisions, and the Beatitudes are always reminded of the importance of our responsibilities, and certainly one of those is obviously to pay attention to those who are incarcerated, and so I admire the efforts here. I have taken the view over the years that there are certain circumstances, Tim, where I would not exclude the use of the death penalty. I don't like to see it anywhere be used as widely and broadly. In fact, I go not just on the current death penalty. I think we need to look at our criminal justice system. I worry in the sense that in too many cases here we're limiting the federal judiciary and state courts to the ability to make wiser choices about what happens in cases that come before them, where our prison systems are so overcrowded with people and growing in populations. And I'm not suggesting we let people out, but the importance of who's going in. In some cases we put people in and they come out an awful lot worse than when they went in the system. And we need to be looking at how you can make better judgments about the incarceration of people in this country. And then to make sure when you come back out that you have the ability to sort of reintegrate it into society without carrying this pariah label on you forever. People who seek to put their lives back in order. The notion of redemption is something that all of us, I would think, in this room embrace, that ought to be a part of life as well. And to be able to say to people who paid a price and want to be reintegrated in society, we ought to welcome them back into society and make them feel welcome where we can and help them make that journey back again. But on the death penalty, I don't take the position of having a universal opposition to it. It is tragic to see what's happened here. And I would agree with Sam on this. I would not go so far as to call for a moratorium at this point here. I'd hope we do a better job of making decisions here that ought to be done fairly quickly, that would be routine in my view. We need a moratorium that anyone facing incarceration, or facing rather execution because of a crime here could check immediately DNA to determine if there's evidence there that would exculpate them from that sentence.
Tim, can I jump in on this prison issue?
Please.
I hope a number of you as students are looking at the possibility of working with people who are incarcerated. We have a national problem on this, and it's a big one. We have about 600,000 people that get out of prison a year in the United States. 2/3 of them will go back. Our prison recidivism rate is about 66%. Once you go into the prison system, you're going back. And your children are 5 times more likely to go into prison if one of the parents are incarcerated. So it gets kind of into the family. And I would hope that some of you would start looking at what can I do in a prison ministry work? What can I do in a work that reduces recidivism? A number of us have a bill called the Second Chance Act, and its effort is to reduce prison recidivism by 50% over 5 years. And it's to seed money and help different programs. Because this is a key issue, and it's one that we can be successful at for the society and for the prisoner. But we've got to start building relationships again with people. And we have, here's again the issue on this separation of church and state. Many of the programs that are most successful in reducing prison recidivism are faith-based programs. And they go at moral reformation. The one I stayed in Louisiana, although it was a state program, the warden down there, he called it moral reformation. And he says, you know, we talk about faith here. He was a good Southern gentleman, and he was saying, you know, my mama, when I went in to become warden down here, she said, you better make sure those boys know about Jesus. You better make sure they know about it, because that's your responsibility. Now, he wasn't saying that, but he did engage faith. And as a result, they've had a big reduction in recidivism. And I really hope you would get involved in this. It is a big need in our country.
Senator Dodd, the church teaching on abortion, gay rights, how do you accept those teachings, read those teachings, become formed by those teachings, and apply them to your political life?
Well, two of the more contentious issues in our society today. Let me take the issue of homosexuality first. An issue of civil unions or gay marriage, which are interestingly, in forums. This past weekend, I think I was in 17 different communities in New Hampshire over 3 days. Covered some 1,200 miles and talking to various people in forums up there. I'm sure Sam has done similar things. Interestingly, Tim, this issue does not come up very often. The assumption that this is raised a lot is I think I get a lot of questions on health care and the Iraq War and education and energy policy and global warming and the like, and I fully expected a lot more of these questions to come up. Now, maybe they'll change in time, but I was sort of surprised in a sense we don't hear quite as often about these questions emerging. Now, that may change. I begin in the issue of homosexuality and the issue of civil unions by asking myself the question of my two daughters may grow up with a different sexual orientation than their parents. And when they do, how do I want them treated? Job opportunities, housing. Could they live in a safe place, not be faced on the kind of hate crimes and so forth that we see victimized on people who have a different sexual orientation? I know there are those who believe this is strictly environmental. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. And they have loving relationships in many cases. And I think that ought to be welcomed when that occurs, and not seen as some frightening prospect for everybody here. And so before you answer the question of what would you do about it, I think it's always not a bad place to begin by asking how would you want your children treated if they arrived at a different conclusion you had. So I, for one, support civil unions. I admire John Lynch in New Hampshire, who has made the decision to recognize that without a court order. Now, I have the notion of marriage is something I just believe is between a man and a woman. And I have a difficult concept here, maybe rhetoric, maybe the difference we're talking about here in civil unions, we're talking about legal status and protections on insurance and health care, disposition of property, wills and the like, and that, in my view, if you've got a loving relationship and that's where it is, that ought to get some protection in my view. I don't go so far as to using the language here, because I'm not comfortable with it at all, the idea of marriage. But on civil unions, I believe they're appropriate. Regarding abortion, again, this is an issue that is obviously been going on a long time, going on 34 years now, since Roe versus Wade, probably before that, obviously, in terms of public policy. And the decision recently in the Supreme Court involving the so-called late-term abortion practices. My own view on that decision was, the 5-4 decision, is we're probably not going to reduce the number of abortions by that decision. People can use other procedures. That was a decision regarding a procedure there. I was very worried, however, about this fact that we're moving away from health considerations to me. This is troublesome to me. Now, putting aside, I know that people are divided on this issue. But for 34 years, the health of a woman has not been something that's been treated lightly on these questions. And I'm worried in a sense that we're sitting here making medical decisions about this particular procedure. But I would hope that we could look at this issue in the context, and others have used this language, which I agree with, that it's rare, to be safe, and that in circumstances, obviously, that some may go beyond, others that it be legal. And that we find ways to really deal with the first issue, and that is to go back to what we were talking about earlier. There are a lot of things we can be doing, in my view, to reduce the incidences of abortion. I think we all agree, I think most do anyway, on one point on all of this, that we'd be all better off if we had less occasions of people making that choice. What sort of decisions can we make to help people not to make that choice, who would prefer another choice? Sam and I will disagree. We disagree on this issue. I respect Sam's point of view on this, and he has every right in the world, and I would argue vehemently with anyone who suggests you shouldn't be able to challenge these questions here. But how can Sam and I come down and find some common ground on some issues that might ultimately reduce the number of abortions occurring in the country? What steps can we take that we could actually make a difference when it comes up to people making those choices? If we spend the next 20 or 30 years arguing about this where it's going to be in the courts forever, I suspect we're not going to get any closer on reducing the incidence. We are legislators right now, presidential candidates, but legislators here. And our job is to sit there and take our life experiences, our faith and others, and bring them to bear on trying to come up with answers. When I wrote the Family and Medical Leave Act and the first child care legislation, I did so. The child care legislation, Orrin Hatch was my partner in that effort. When I wrote the Family and Medical Leave Act, I did so with Kit Bond and Dan Coates. When I wrote the legislation dealing with better pharmaceuticals for children, the premature birth issues, autism, and infant screening, I did it with Mike DeWine of Ohio. In every single case, there were conservative Republicans that I sat down with and worked on some concepts and ideas that could make a difference in families and children's lives. And that's what we need to be doing as legislators, in my view. That doesn't mean we should retreat on our positions. But in the meantime, while we're stating our positions, we bear an obligation, if we're truly interested in reducing the problem here, to find some ways of commonality to come up and make a real significant inroad in this problem that people talk about. So that's where I stand on the issue. Would welcome the opportunity. We're going to introduce some legislation in the next few days dealing with exactly that, and that is to offer some real support and backing on adoption practices and children's health and other issues that we think may make a difference in reducing those numbers, which I hope all of us, I believe, in this room would applaud.
Same question, Senator Brownback. How did the church teachings on abortion and gay rights affect, influence, form your political decision-making on those issues?
Well, not a great deal initially, because as I mentioned, I joined the Catholic Church about 4 years ago, and I was pro-life before that period of time. And I looked at it, and it seemed to me that it's that distinction, person or property, and I started out as an embryo like everybody else here did, and if you kill me then, I'm not here today. I do think that the basic issue of church teaching on human dignity is very important on this topic. And I've mentioned it several times here tonight, but it strikes me as right at the core of these things is human dignity. Is the youngest of humans entitled to the dignity of personhood? And the church has been teaching and thinking about this a long time, and the church says, yes, you're entitled to human dignity. You're entitled to it from the very earliest stages. And you should be protected from society. It's an interesting debate, too. I mentioned person or property. We've also had the debate about, well, yes, the youngest of humans is alive, but it's not a life. People make that distinction. And I thought, well, I'm a recovering lawyer like many people in the Congress, and that strikes me as a lawyer's answer there. This is human life. That's how we all started, and it is entitled to protection. And it should be that way. As a result of our abortion policies in this country, and I noted this to some people earlier, we've had some very strange and I think very devastating effects in this country. We have over 40 million people that are not here, that should be here since Roe versus Wade with the level of abortions in the country. If you see somebody with Down syndrome, I hope you go out and give them a big hug, because 80 to 90% of the people with a diagnosis of Down syndrome in utero are aborted. And the system pushes that. The system pushes that they would be aborted. And I know that's a difficult circumstance, but there are people out there waiting to adopt children with Down syndrome. And I would just plead with people, don't abort them. Let us adopt them. Let people adopt them and go that route. And I know it's a tough situation for people, but just life is a beautiful thing no matter what its nature or who it is. So to me, on the life, I think this is a very clear one and one we need to get right.
And on civil unions?
And civil unions is another human dignity issue, if I might add. And this is a very difficult one, I find. Whoever you are and wherever you are and whatever you stand for, you have dignity as an individual. And that applies to somebody that has a particular different gender orientation, I think, as well. They're dignified as an individual and should be treated as such. But here in the church teachings do separate the status of the individual from the act itself. And they say the status of the individual is entitled to dignity, and they are. The act itself is wrong. The act itself is immoral. And this is a very difficult thing. And because everybody knows people that are in different circumstances or have different persuasions. I still don't think we as a society then should step up and honor that with the status of marriage, and I want to take that issue first, or the status of civil unions, and I want to say why on this. Separating again out the person who has dignity from the act, which is immoral. Looking at what about the state setting up and authorizing this in the form of marriage or in civil unions. What we've seen when other countries have done this is it's driven down the number of people who have gotten married, the number of heterosexual couples that have gotten married. And the issue is when you take away the sacredness or the uniqueness of marriage and you start redefining it, a lot of people just say, well, the institution doesn't have the meaning to me. And so you now see Northern European countries where you have 80% of your firstborn children born out of wedlock. You're driving down the number of children in a stable family setting. And you can raise good children in other than a two-parent family. But we know in our hearts, we know from the social data, that's the best place to raise children. The last thing we need to do in America is drive down the number of families. We need more families in America. We need stronger families in America, not fewer. And that's why I do not believe this is the way for us to go on a very, very tough issue, Chris. And, Tim, I might just include on a very tough issue. And I don't want to come across as harsh or mean on this. I just think these are tough, very personal issues.
Well, just a couple of things. One is this is not a persuasion people have. It's a sexual orientation, and not a gender orientation. And Sam did write the legislation, dealing with Down syndrome, which I applaud. His major co-sponsor in that bill was the senior senator from the state, Ted Kennedy. So when we talk about coming together and resolving issues, this is a good example. But it's important to point, it was Sam and Ted Kennedy that put that bill together to make a difference in people's lives. And that's the point I've been making, is coming together and finding that common ground where they can do something worthwhile.
Before we go, we're not going to pass the hat and raise money for these campaigns. This is Boston College. All money goes to the
Boston
University
College.
Right?
I've got a nephew by marriage, by the way, Sean Lynch, who's a student here. I want to make, if I don't go home, if I didn't say that, I couldn't go home tonight, so I have to mention it.
But there are a lot of students here, a lot of energetic people. New Hampshire's about an hour away.
Not even that far.
I want to give each of you 2 minutes. The mission of Boston College: training young men and women for others. Senator Brownback, Senator Dodd, why should someone from Boston College get in that van tomorrow and drive to New Hampshire and work for Sam Brownback? How will he make this country a place that fulfills that mission of men and women for others?
Well, first, let me thank you and Boston College for putting this together. I think this is wonderful. I'm delighted that what you're focusing on here are matters of the heart, of the soul. One of the things I think we've walked away from in public life and in our public universities too much in this country, and private universities as well, is we'll develop the mind, but we're not developing the soul. And both need to be developed for a well-rounded person. You need a good head and a good soul. And so continue to do that. And I would say, Tim, that's what I'm about. That's what I want to do. I want to see this country rejuvenate our culture, rebuild our families, and have another American century based on goodness. That we are great as long as we're good. And if we ever lose our fundamental goodness, we will surely lose our greatness. And that's what I want to see done. And that's why I'm pro-life and whole life. And that's why I think that we need to do these things of the heart and take on tough problems that may not seem like traditional Republican problems. And I hope you'll get in there and help me with it. Or if you don't, find a candidate that you do support or a cause that you do support and get into that. One final thought. There's a great book out there called The Dream Giver. It's written by Wilkerson. It'll take you an evening to read it. Please, any student here, go check it out and read it. And it talks about the dream that each of you are given. And you're each given a unique dream that's just particular to you. But the interesting thing about your dream is it's not for you. If a good dream is not for you, it's for somebody else. And if you don't follow your dream, somebody else gets hurt. If Chris Dodd doesn't go to the Dominican Republic, somebody else gets hurt. Now, he could have stayed home, could have made money, could have done this or that, but no, he goes there. That's the same for you. A good dream is for somebody else. Find your specific dream and calling to help others. Build the head, build the heart, and change the world. Thanks. God bless you all.
Senator Dodd.
Well, thank you, Tim, very much. Father Leahy, thank you very much for hosting these forums. It's a great contribution to this community, and to have those of us be here and to share our thoughts and feelings with you, and to learn as well. So we thank you, thank Boston College immensely for the chance to be here this evening. It's been very worthwhile. And give you a campaign talk here. I would hope. Love to have you help in the campaign. I happen to believe we're living in a time here where so much is at stake. I mentioned earlier my two daughters. My daughter, I have a 5-year-old and 2-year-old. I'm the only presidential candidate who gets mail from AARP and diaper services. I have a rather broad reach here with these two young ladies. Grace was born 48 hours after 9/11 in Arlington, Virginia. And my wife Jackie was actually on the way to the hospital on the morning of 9/11 because she has bad asthma and she was on some medication that they'd taken her off, and the assumption was that Grace would arrive that day. When she saw the Pentagon get hit, she turned the car around, went back, and they put her back on the medication, and Grace arrived on the 13th of September. Both of her grandmothers were named Grace, but even had that not been the case, I think in light of what occurred that day, the world could have used a little, and so Grace would have probably been her name anyway. Along the way, I mention her only because I think about her, and I have since the moment she arrived, and wondering what kind of a world, what kind of a country she's going to grow up in. What are you and I going to do? I didn't dream about running for the presidency. I've been very happy to serve in the Senate, elected 3 times to the House and 5 times by the people of Connecticut to the United States Senate, 26 years there. But I decided that I wanted to. Okay. Thanks. Let me get through my remarks and we'll talk afterwards. And my point being here that this is a collective responsibility. I'll just tell you one quick story here. I don't know whether it's totally accurate or not, but in public life, people think campaigns are about the candidates. I've always raised to believe that campaigns are about the people you seek to represent. What goes on in their lives. And the question that every person asks a person seeking their support is the following. Do you know who I am? Do you know what I'm going through? Do you know what my dreams and aspirations, what my hopes are? What I would love to see, the kind of life my children have in the future. And I want to know whether or not you get that. And if you do, and I get a sense of that, then I'm willing to listen to your other ideas. There was a wonderful story of Franklin Roosevelt on the day 2 days after he passed away, of his casket going down Constitution Avenue. And a reporter was covering the event and interviewing people. And one individual seemed more grief-stricken than the rest. And the reporter went up to him and said, "You must have known Franklin Roosevelt very well." He said, "I didn't know him at all." He said, "Well, why you seem so grief-stricken, more so than the rest?" He said, "I didn't know Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt knew me." And I thought that what a wonderful thing to be said about people in public life. At the end of your career, it could be said that they felt you knew who they were. We need to do a lot of things together in this country briefly. My daughter is going to ask you and I someday what we did at the outset of the 21st century to get this right. And we better have some better answers than the ones we're providing on a variety of issues than just going off and sort of our respective corners, as I said earlier, and arguing with each other about issues. People want us to come up with answers. They want experience. The answers are pulling people together to see if we can't move our country forward. That's going to be critically important, in my view, both at home and abroad, whether or not we can rebuild those alliances. I remember so well on the morning of September 12th and 13th, reading the newspaper accounts around the world after 9/11, how the world really wanted to be with us and work with us. I'm deeply worried that we're getting isolated every single day, further and further away, becoming less secure in our country, and not working with people to come up with better answers on the problems we face. So I can't think of another time when being involved in trying to fix things has been as important as it is today. And whether it's a decision to get involved in a campaign, or join the Peace Corps, or Vista, or Jesuit volunteers, getting involved in your communities or church groups, whatever it is, I hope you're going to sense that importance of being involved in things larger than yourselves. If you do, I promise you this much. You will never, ever have a greater sense of gratification than doing something to make the lives of other people better. If you've done this already as volunteers yourself, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That wonderful exhilaration of knowing you've made the life of a child or a family a little bit easier because of what you've done. Getting engaged in the public life of our country is a responsibility. I'd like to see a lot more Catholics running for public office and holding public office and standing up and fighting on behalf of those who need your help. Thank you immensely for inviting us with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Boston College. Once again, you've demonstrated that you can sit and talk about religion and politics in an atmosphere of passion and civility. Thank you. And gentlemen, you are now both honorary Eagles.
Eagles! Yeah! All right. Eagles!
Now that you've joined the ACC, I can wear this all right, you see.
We've been privileged to listen to two very careful thinkers and public servants. It's clear that they both have a passion for bringing careful thought to public discourse, so we thank them both. Thank you, Senator Brownback. Thank you, Senator Dodd. Thank you, Tim Russert, and good night.